Привіт, це подкаст «Коли все має значення» і моє ім'я Наталя Гуменюк.
А моє ім'я Ангеліна Карякіна. І ми сьогодні говоримо про чергового гостя Наталки, ще одного професора і автора Джейсона Стенлі, дослідника, зокрема, пропаганди, авторитаризму, фашизму, про який він написав книгу. Наталко, розкажи, будь ласка, за яких обставин ти його записала і що Джейсон Стенлі робить в Україні?
Я також додам, що Джейсон Стенлі є одним з провідних лівих інтелектуалів у світі, який досліджує питання боротьби з фашизмом, тоталітаризму, антиколоніальної боротьби. Торік він приїхав до Київської школи економіки, де читав лекції, і повернувся читати нові лекції. Додам, що Джейсон Стенлі всі свої там отримані кошти і, зрештою, щонайменше $20,000, які він мав отримати, перерахував до фонду «Повернись живим» і ще частину для українського громадянського суспільства. Він є дуже великим другом, прямо одним з найближчих, Тімоті Снайдера і Марсі Шор. Я не була знайома з ним до минулого року. Він минулого року під час війни вперше приїхав саме до України, оскільки він досліджує фашизм, а тут бореться з фашизмом. Він приїхав сюди, був надзвичайно вражений, ми тоді познайомилися.
Що для себе неочікувано ти від нього почула і довкола чого ви будували розмову? Це був авторитаризм, фашизм, пропаганда, про що саме ви говорили?
Чесно кажучи, торік, якби це була розмова перший раз, я з ним багато говорила про фашизм і колоніалізм. Цьогорічний курс був про фашизм, а торічний курс був про колоніалізм. І це було щось дуже таке популярне, нове і модне. Але треба розуміти, що Джейсон дуже категоричний в своїх висловлюваннях і поглядах. Він максимально критичний до американського уряду. Його коло середовище – це рух темношкірих, це рух за громадянські права. І тому ми можемо уявити аудиторію українських студентів, коли їм оперують термінами, які в Україні часто є викривленими. Коли для нього прогресивна боротьба – це антифашистська боротьба, це ця термінологія. Він говорить про злочини Сполучених Штатів. Він може в чомусь розказувати там, де є позитивні сторони там соціалізму і комунізму. Мені це цікаво, бо в нас мало лівих інтелектуалів сюди приїжджають, які так відверто підтримують, але які дуже чисті в своїх судженнях, які там засуджують націоналізм як націоналізм, не визвольний націоналізм, а той націоналізм, який там потім приводить до неонацизму. Але оскільки Джейсон давав багато інтерв'ю, чесно кажучи, в Україні, і от як Фукуяму завжди питають про кінець історії, так Джейсону ставлять 3 стандартних питання. Типу, поясніть, чому Росія фашистська, поясніть, чому Україна колонія. Просто ніби давайте, от ви лівий професор, ви підтвердите все, що ми хочемо від вас почути. Мені швидше було цікаво теж почути, а що викликає резонанс, а як зрезонувала його лекції українським студентам, але я загалом говорила про глобальний лівий рух. Зокрема, питання того, чому він вважає, що він фактично асоціює себе, умовно, з тими антифашистами, які приїжджали боротися з Франко в 30-ті в Іспанії, і чому світові ліві сьогодні відмовляються від збройної боротьби. Що мене ще вразило, і це мене правда тоді вразило торік, бо я, правда, не знала, і сподіваюся, я надихнула аудиторію. Я, наприклад, не знала дуже багато якихось апологетів і теоретиків руху за громадянські права і, скажімо, цієї академічної спільноти, так, скажімо, як того самого Боиса. І Джейсон мені сказав, тут вийшло, що тут у вас в Україні, коли він перший раз приїжджав, спільнота академічна, люди нічого не знають про рух за громадянські права, не знають теоретичного підґрунтя. А я кажу, та Джейсон, а чого вони мають це знати? Це ж про Америку. Він каже, це світове надбання. Якщо ви хоч якось хочете називати себе інтелектуалом хоч трошки, ви не можете не знати теоретичну основу боротьби за, громадянські права, бо вона стала основою всіх правозахисних рухів. Як таке, що правозахисник не читав Боис?
Ми просто не про теорію, про практику. Ми практикуємо рухи за громадянські права.
І я зрозуміла, що мені дуже подобається, імпонує ця категоричність в тому, що, кажу, я розумію, що люди не мають знати, але якщо ти хочеш спілкуватися з американцями і хоч трошки щось розуміти про Сполучені Штати, ти не можеш не знати цих імен. Тому ми говорили і про те, як знайти порозуміння з темношкірими американцями, бо в нього дуже багато паралелей з тим, чому українська боротьба дуже схожа на цю боротьбу. і про корисних ідіотів серед лівих. Тобто це була розмова, мої питання, як людина, яка швидше сповідує там ліві погляди прогресивні, отих критичних питань, які часто задають лівим. Тільки в такому ключі це те, що, чесно кажучи, було цікаво, але очевидно, там, звісно, є і про фашизм, і про колоніалізм, і чому факт, що Україна є колонією, не настільки очевидний в академічних спільнотах, бо це і є ця спільнота, яку представляє Стенлі. Коли ми говоримо, що якась академічна спільнота не сприймає, то це і є ця спільнота, це і є він, і він є тою людиною, яка може на ці питання, як мені здається, відповісти, бо він якби дуже ідеологічно вмотивований. Я додам, що він ще є антифашист з єврейської родини, цілілих в Голокості. Для нього це надзвичайно велика частина його ідентичності, який є абсолютним критиком Ізраїлі в чинному конфлікті проти Гази, який максимально захищає палестинців і розповідає, в чому проблема, на його думку. Тобто він людина поглядів. І до цього, тому що ми інколи, коли з кимось говоримо, там, з журналістами, з рештою, люди кажуть, а буває так, а я думаю таким чином, а я політик. Джейсон Стенлі є людиною ідеологічною, яка певну ідеологію пропонує, що є нормальним, з нею можна погоджуватися, не погоджуватися, але саме тому з ним дуже цікаво говорити, і він дуже закоханий в Київ, він любить тут бувати, він вважає, що він є частиною цієї боротьби з світовим фашизмом.
Слухай, виходить повний баланс. В тебе така вийшла академічна трійка: Макфол, Фукуяма і Стенлі з різних політичних спектрів. Значить, у нас тут ліберальні кола, консервативні і ліві. І
$20,000 для «Повернись живим» не забувайте. Якщо це можна тут сказати, що треба розуміти, це не якісь там мільйонери, які, для таких людей це велика сума. Якби не просто отак, от в мене є зайві гроші, тому йому є куди їх витратити. Так, тому я дуже це ціную, як то кажуть, не словом, а ділом.
Ну що ж, дуже круто знати, що люди такого масштабу, ще й такого масштабу друзі України. Я знаю, що і ти також дотична певним чином до того, як скерувати бажання допомогти і там якийсь альтруїзм, тому це теж дуже круто. Я думаю, ти теж заслуговуєш на подяку в цьому сенсі. Ну що ж, давайте слухати розмову Наталки з Джейсоном Стенлі в нашому подкасті «Коли все має значення».
Jason, I in fact was waiting for you for quite a long time in this studio because, we met last summer, and I thought that would be great. You were in very high on priority in the list of the people in the podcast, but I thought then Jason will return to Kyiv and then I would talk to him. Why should I kind of Zoom? So great to be with you again. What you were doing here?
Well, in the first instance, I've come because I think it's like the Spanish Civil War, and if you're committed to fight fascism, you've got to show up in Ukraine. So last year I asked Kyiv School of Economics if I could teach a course on colonialism and fascism here. So I taught 8 classes, and then I accepted a distinguished professorship at Kyiv School of Economics, and my salary goes to Come Back Alive. Half of it goes to Come Back Alive, and the other half of it goes to civil society organizations.
Thank you for that. Actually, you made the start. That was my first question. You mentioned Spanish Civil War and the role, if you're anti-fascist, you should be there. It was very interesting. I had a friend who is hardcore left. He was dealing with the trade unions. He was fighting, and after Bakhmut, he had a chance to talk to a number of the Latin American journalists. They asked him very clearly, so how would you explain why people should support in Latin America this fight? And he said, I'm anti-fascist. Disregarding it's Ukraine, if I'm anti-fascist, I need to fight fascism of the Kremlin. But today, I see that there is a reluctancy of the left to think about the military part of the anti-fascist war. Can you explain it and elaborate more? Yes, we understand how the nationalism and fascism is playing with military, but we still today associate the left cause, often progressive cause, with pacifism, and that's kind of very much labeled. But in fact, left also grew up from fighting fascism.
As in the Spanish Civil War.
And later, if you speak about the defeating Hitler, who was, like fascist. Yeah. So can you explain how we can speak and where the role of military in the fight against fascism today?
First of all, every single Democratic congressperson voted to fund weapons for Ukraine. Bernie Sanders is for purchasing weapons for Ukraine. Rashida Tlaib voted for purchasing weapons for Ukraine. There's a group of Congress people, Rashida Tlaib and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are two of them, and Tlaib is Palestinian, and they're both the members of what's called the Squad, and they're the leftmost Congress people. So Tlaib is highly critical of U.S. foreign policy in Israel. And all of the far left in Congress voted to pay for weapons for Ukraine. It's somewhat of a myth that the left don't support it. Half the Republican Party voted against weapons for Ukraine, and the entire Democratic Party voted for weapons for Ukraine. Left, centrist, all of them. Right now, I don't need to tell Ukrainians, I don't need to tell you that the focus of the American left is on stopping the flow of weapons to Israel. Because it looks like Israel is committing or on the road to committing a genocide. You can't support that. When people say they don't support weapons right now in this context, they're thinking about Israel and Gaza. They are not thinking about Russia and Ukraine.
I'm rather speaking about this general cause. German left, European left, British, generally American. People who are left, they are today, usually their demos are against the war, but usually it meant let's stop the wars. It's never really today about the fight to stop the war.
So I think that's a misreading. I think that there are different explanations in different countries. I think take some of the college protests right now. They're all about Gaza in the United States, but some of the demands are to ask universities to divest from weapons manufacturers. And the reason they're doing that is they don't want to appear anti-Semitic. They don't want to say they're singling out Israel. So it's purely strategic. In the case of the German left, well, it's because if you look at Nazi textbooks, they're always talking about the evils of the Russians. Now, they often mean the Ukrainians. They're not making a difference. So in the German public space, they don't want to fund weapons against Russia because they think that has something to do with their past. Timothy Snyder has effectively taken that on. But I think it's somewhat of a myth that this is the left. I think, as I just said, the left in the United States has voted 100% to fund weapons, buying weapons for Ukraine. Bernie Sanders, the leader of the American left, has supported it.
So you won't just even share it am I mistaken in my kind of perception about more general patterns and narratives? I'm speaking about last years prior to Gaza, the left are usually pacifist.
I think historically you're right, because if you look at America, the United States, every war since World War II has been wrong. I mean, Vietnam, completely pointless war. Every 30 years, the United States decides to kill a whole lot of non-white people for no reason at all. In America, if you're anti-war, you tend to be right. So except for World War II, you would be right. It would be perfectly correct to be anti-war. And Ronald Reagan funded death squads in Central America. So I made those mistakes that you are. I don't think I thought through them. I just said we shouldn't be buying weapons for right-wing death squads in Central America. But when it comes to Ukraine is fighting a violent, terroristic, fascist state that is trying to extinguish Ukrainian identity. And of course you need weapons.
But you think that the global left, I don't know what is it,
right.
To be honest. I don't know what is
Aren't you on the global left?
I am. I definitely am. I'm definitely global. I'm definitely left. But I don't really understand what it is concept today. For you as a professor, somebody who is kind of known in the movement, you clearly, identify yourself with a left cause, you're teaching abroad, you're researching. What is global left today?
I think it's tricky to say because each country has a different perspective. if you're on the global left in Latin America, there's a kind of knee-jerk reaction to whatever the United States is doing. You just assume that whatever the United States is doing is wrong. I'm not like that. I think the United States is capable of doing great and positive things, but I understand why you might think that anytime the United States, if you're Latin American, that you might think that way because we kept on toppling democracies and replacing them with dictators. So I'm not sure there is a global left right now. I think there's an anti-capitalist part of the global left, which is perfectly coherent. Capitalism had a terrible effect on the former Soviet Union, these areas. It created oligarchical gangster capitalism. But I think right now, capitalism is not the problem. Russian imperialism is the problem. Capitalism is involved. Autocracy is involved. As Anne Applebaum would say, we've got oligarchs, the fossil fuel oligarchs feeding these autocratic movements. We have the tech fascists, the Silicon Valley people. But I think it's hard for some portions of the global left to understand that capitalism isn't the only enemy. The enemy is also imperialism. The global left should know this because they're the anti-imperialists.
I think when I was inviting you this interview, and the question I really asked was like, does every single interview in Ukraine starts with like, can you explain us why Russia is fascist? Because to be honest, that's why you invited in Ukraine, because people want to hear what they want to hear. And you being left, being profoundly, not kind of a bit atypical, you're telling what people want to hear about Russia and about, imperialism and colonialism and explaining that. So it's really great to have the allies from all political spectrums. I'm keeping also the book, which is called How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them, which is translated into Ukrainian by the KM Books. But then I'm not really just asking to explain why Russia is fascism, but really, don't you feel this term is treated internationally as outdated? Like nobody uses this term beyond you, to be honest. Tim, and he tries, but it doesn't work perfectly. And people are reluctant to use the term fascism anywhere beyond Nazi Germany and Italy and some of the, this Eastern European regimes of that period of time.
That's because you don't come from the Black American tradition. The Black American tradition has always called the United States fascist. Angela Davis calls the United States fascist because if you're Black, you're facing a police state. I mean, white Americans wouldn't necessarily call the United States fascist, but Black Americans, as Langston Hughes, the Black American poet, said when he came to Paris in 1937, he's like, you don't need to tell us what fascism is. It's just European for Jim Crow, the Jim Crow regime being the American regime in the South where Black people couldn't vote until 1965. The U.S. Jim Crow laws deeply influenced the Nazis. We have this long history of racial exclusion, of a police state. This structure of targeting, scapegoating groups, scapegoating minorities, in this case, the link between imperialism and fascism, if you read Césaire or even if you read Hannah Arendt, we read Du Bois, these are anti-colonial theorists who, when they theorize fascism, always talk about imperialism. What happens is you get used to treating other people in brutal ways, and then you treat your own population in brutal ways. So similarly, we see you treated Black Americans in brutal ways, and now, of course, they're going to be treating political opponents like that. And so that link between imperialism and fascism is central to the history of imperialism and the literature on imperialism and the literature on fascism. I think it's more like reveals the kind of locality and provinciality of the European left to only talk of fascism as a European thing. I work in the Black American tradition, and there's a longer history of using fascism as a broader term to refer to attacks on LGBT, attacks on minorities. If you look at American fascism in the 1930s, the America First movement, you'll see, and they were funded by the National Socialists, as Rachel Maddow has been showing, and they were anti-immigration. They had all these features that we now see of contemporary fascist movements like the far right in Western Europe. You need a term for a far right authoritarian society that's anti-LGBT, anti-women's rights, anti-immigration, and pro-imperialism. What other term are you going to use?
But this reluctancy to kind of mass media and everybody to use it. People actually sometimes they say neo-Nazi, yes, but mean very clearly far-right group something. But fascist, people just
Well, that's because it has become a slur term. It's become an insult. There's a reluctance to use an insult as sort of neutral, quote-unquote, neutral vocabulary. And the media are supposed to only use neutral vocabulary. They talk about, in America, the alt-right as a name. But do you know who invented the term, the alt-right?
Alt-right.
The Nazis, the American Nazi. The white nationalists invented the term alt-right because they want a term that isn't negative for their ideology.
We have our experience of Russia, what you are saying, mirroring the terms, we're misusing the term anti-fascism. Their fight against Ukraine as anti-fascist fight. So I think it made Ukrainians pretty reluctant to use anti-fascist term in its kind of pure way, which probably what Ukrainian troops are doing now in the battlefield. How would you say is perceived by the audiences here, by your students? What are questions they are puzzled with?
Well, one of the very exciting things about being in Ukraine and being part of your freedom struggle is seeing how much your country is defining itself over time, how quickly this process of figuring out what should a Ukrainian be, what should Ukrainian identity be, is happening. I'm seeing the students from my class last year going into the media, starting to become people who influence the discussion in Ukraine. So I did an interview this morning with Yulia Tomyshenko, who was a student in the class last year and is now a prominent podcaster in Ukraine. It's exciting to see. Last year we're discussing issues that this year are kind of everyone is used to. Last year is kind of radical to talk about colonialism and imperialism. And this year, it's obvious. I mean, my country is run by old men, but Ukraine, these debates about what Ukraine is you're only 40 and you're a heroic old school journalist in this country already. The 25-year-olds are helping to define things. So what I've learned from Ukrainians in my class, I try to be with them in this discussion of what should Ukraine be? And we kind of discuss it together. Part of my role, I do provocations. I always relentlessly talk about how bad Europe is and how you would never want to associate yourself with Europe.
But in different terms that the fascist Kremlin speak about that.
Right. Well, interestingly, Putin always talks about, he says he's defending Europe. If you read carefully, Putin is always saying he's the one who's defending Europe. He's defending the traditional values of Europe. And what he's saying in his propaganda, it's very subtle. He's saying Russia is defending the traditional values of Europe. And he's saying what you now see is decadence and anti-civilization. He's saying Russia is defending civilization and the old values of Europe. And what Ukraine represents is anti-civilization. So it isn't like African colonialism, where you're invading a country that you then say are savages. It's more like what Hitler said about the Jews. Hitler said Jews are responsible for LGBT, Jews are decadent, Jews are responsible for women's equality, and they're destroying civilization, where civilization meant Christian values, traditional values. And that's what Putin is saying about Ukraine.
So what are your other provocations? How do you provoke your students and how they react?
I say Europe is known the world over as, for its genocides. I talk about what Ronald Reagan did in Central America. Whenever I talk about Ronald Reagan, I said, he funded the killing of hundreds of thousands of suspected communists. I am clearly a left-winger because of the resonance of the Soviet Union. People react negatively to you saying you're left-wing. Here's the biggest provocation, but it's not intended as a it's just true. I think that if you're going to build a healthy nationalism, It has to be a nationalism that looks back over the history of your own country and sees the bad things your country did.
Or your society, if you didn't have country at that time. I think it's very important. I think that's quite often an excuse because we didn't have country. How do you take the responsibility for something which some armed foreign groups, in Volyn did because there was no such country in that regard. So I think for Ukraine, it's something to... I mentioned that it's not really just about the country, but society, because in Ukraine, we didn't have for a long time the country. There was no state, but there was some art groups, some people who did something, or there were the Ukrainians who lived under different empires.
That's right. Some Ukrainian nationalists killed lots of Jewish people, did pogroms, participated in the killing of Jewish people, participated in the killing of Poles, or did kill Poles, large numbers of Poles. Those are things a healthy nation remembers. The other thing I try to urge is that, I try to point out, and it's not a provocation, it's just true, that Ukraine is one of the two countries where Jewish people come from in the 19th, 18th, 17th, 16th century. Poland and Ukraine had the largest populations of Jews, I think, in the world. I might be wrong about that, but I think in the world. And most Jewish people that you meet in the world tell you they come from Poland or Ukraine. But I found the Ukrainian self-conception does not include this. There's this kind of, we have villages and we come from the Ukrainian Orthodoxy. It's even worse in Poland. Rabbi Schneerson comes from Ukraine, and he's like the Jesus Christ for like millions of Jews.
But, there is like this temptation to say, like Steven Spielberg, as long as there is a celebrity saying like, and my parents were born somewhere in that shtetl or in Odessa, you're like, yes, he's a bit Ukrainian.
Right. No, I think democracies need to be multi-ethnic, multi-religious. It's dangerous when you have this image of a true American, for instance, being a white Christian. Or in India, it's dangerous when you have this vision of a true Indian being Hindu, right? That's what we see now. So Ukraine, I'm always trying to emphasize, is a diverse country. There's Crimean Tatar. There's a range of ethnic groups, a range of religions, and all of them are Ukrainian. And eventually Ukraine will need immigration.
You mentioned Angela Davis, and I want to explain this connection or sometimes misconception of the black fight. We understand that during the civil movement, you have among the black cause a lot of Marxists. Mm-hmm. At that time, we had Soviet Union, and there is like relations and people in Ukraine suffered because of the communist regime a lot. A lot of people had been murdered. So you kind of like don't understand why these people embraced communism there. But in this regard, how would you explain this admiration of communism and Marxism by the black cause, how they are connected, and how it could be put into the context? And how do you put it in the contents, knowing all the, history of Eastern Europe, history of the Soviet Union, and as well, how we need to speak about that today and maybe reconcile in some way.
The Marxist perspective on the Black freedom movement says that Black people and white people are equal. They're all workers. And the labor movement and the civil rights movement work together. So the people because in the labor movement, it was poor Blacks and poor whites together, united. So the idea of a working class movement to challenge wealth is one that by its nature is multiracial. In America, what you have to understand, the way racism works is it's something the wealthy use to split the working class, to make sure that Black workers and white workers don't get together in a labor movement. Now, if you think about the identity, the ideology behind the view that it doesn't matter what your race is, it doesn't matter what your background is, you're all workers fighting for your rights. That's one aspect of Marxism, to tell you, stop thinking of your identity as a white person and start thinking of your identity as a worker. If you go to the South today, labor organizers in the South have told me that when you're doing a labor movement, when you're organizing a union, you're organizing people with Ku Klux Klan flags and Black workers together. because they all hate the boss. The ideology that race doesn't matter, that what matters is that you're oppressed by wealth, and the fact that wealthy oligarchs in America were using racism to split black and white people up, explains why an ideology like Workers of the World Unite would be powerful.
When we were really discussing that, I said, but look, in Ukraine, people don't really very much know that much about civil rights movements and the black cause and the intellectual thinking about that. And, I take it as a norm. And then you told it shouldn't be. And I'm not speaking about the general Ukrainian population. I'm speaking about, Ukrainian intellectuals, Ukrainian academia. It just happened that, yes, here people didn't read Du Bois. They didn't. I thought it's okay. It's an American thing, why we Ukrainians should learn Du Bois. And you said how you come not to read if you're really fighting this fight? Can you really explain why we should know about that? Why it's absolutely essential for a modern person?
Let me just give an example. Du Bois wrote...
Who is that?
So W.E.B. Du Bois is... he was a gigantically productive black intellectual who graduated valedictorian of Harvard in the 1890s, the top student at Harvard, the first black valedictorian. Then he went and got his PhD in Germany at Humboldt University. He wrote he was one of the founders of sociology. He wrote a book, The Philadelphia Negro, which was a study of black people in Philadelphia showing the black middle class. He wrote this book, Souls of Black Folk, which was arguing for equal rights and equal education for black people and equal political involvement. He wrote, as opposed to his competition, Booker T. Washington, who was arguing that black people should just focus on getting rich. And then he wrote this book, Black Reconstruction. I mean, he wrote so much. He wrote 5 novels, but Black Reconstruction is what I consider to be his masterpiece. Historically, it's about how... So you had this 10-year period after the Civil War, after 1865, where black people were allowed to vote in the South. And then it ended, and black people were not allowed to vote for another 90 years. First of all, what it shows is that progress can immediately be reversed. So you could have a freedom struggle, and then it just ends. And what he's doing in that book is he's showing that autocrats, rich people, authoritarians use national identity as a way to confuse people. He's talking about whiteness. He talks about the psychological wages of whiteness. Being white gives you a certain amount, gives you a certain pride. And he's trying to explain why poor whites will sacrifice their own interests to be over black people. So he's saying it's something that rich people use to manipulate poor people. So let's apply it to Russia and Ukraine.
And that's why I want to insert that, and I still want to because I was reading this totally different, a fascinating book of the Korean scholar who was explaining modern Korean culture and the growth of it. He's from one of the American universities, and he was really using a lot of examples of Du Bois to explain Koreans to the Americans. What does it mean to have with this double consciousness? When you were for years Korean under Japanese rule, and you kind of developed something which made Koreans to understand Americans better, Americans black, and kind of find the common ground to explain their struggle. And that's when I thought wow, if there would be somebody Ukrainian who would refer to Du Bois that much, so maybe there would be some Americans to understand. Then when I thought your idea about Du Bois was very interesting, how to explain Ukraine to the people. So now your turn.
So there are 2 concepts that we can take from Du Bois. There are many concepts, but here are 2 important concepts we can use. One is the psychological wages of whiteness. What he means by that is poor whites who have nothing, nevertheless are proud of being white. And so we can talk about the psychological wages of Russianness. Just by being Russian, it gives you pride, and Ukrainians are offensive because they're not proud to be Russian. So it explains how Putin can manipulate Russians into supporting a war that's not in their interests. That's one concept. The other concept is the concept you just talked about, and that's from Souls of Black Folk, the book that I mentioned before, 1903. And that's double consciousness. There Du Bois is saying, the double consciousness, he's saying, if you're black, you have to understand that when you walk into a room, white people are not looking at you the way you view yourself. They're looking at you as dangerous. You don't view yourself as dangerous.
So how would you also put it in our current context?
Easy to do. A Ukrainian would meet a Russian, be friendly. I'm going to tell you about my culture. And a Ukrainian would just see themselves as a normal person with a different culture. But the Russian will see the Ukrainian as a threat. Unless you're aware of how you're seen through the eyes of others, you're bringing yourself in danger. If you're a woman and you don't understand that men can view you as a sex object, then you're going to bring yourself in danger. If you're Ukrainian and you think that Russians will see you differently than you see yourself, unless you realize that, you'll be in danger.
How you think that, what are today's the best ways to explain what's going on in Ukraine to the American Black community?
I think the journalist Terrell Jermaine Starr is doing a lot of this work today, but the situations are not quite analogous because it's not like white America is trying to annihilate Black identity. It's more like Ukrainians from that perspective are like indigenous Americans, where they're trying to wipe out the identity. However, Black Americans are very responsive to oppressed people, to people who are undergoing kind of imperialist, colonialist identity oppression. And Black Americans are central to the American left. They're like kind of the leaders of the American left. Black Americans are a powerful voting bloc. They're a powerful cultural bloc, a powerful intellectual bloc. And if they see what's happening here as Ukrainian identity being set under Russian identity, like Black identity is set under white identity, then they'll see it. They'll understand what's going on. Like they do, they're strong supporters of the Palestinian cause because they see that as a certain kind of oppression that has a relationship to the one that they have.
I won't ask you to explain why Ukraine is a colony. It's actually something to discuss because it's pretty unusual and atypical. We still need to understand how to speak about that and research, and we have to research in academia, first of all. So first of all, how do you think we should really think about putting this research? What are the questions to ask regarding the Ukraine as a colony and Russian as an empire? What are questions are not answered in Western or wherever global academia?
First of all, I think the parallels between no two colonial situations are the same, but there are strong parallels between British colonialism in Africa and what's happening here with Russia. They're not exactly the same because it's not like the British saw Kenyans, for example, as little British people. It's not like they saw that, but they tried to extinguish the indigenous languages. The British tried to, if you were caught speaking Kikuyu, a tribal language in Kenya, in class, you were humiliated, beaten, forced to wear a sign saying, "I am stupid." Sound familiar? The British had concentration camps where they did a process called screening to see if people had Kikuyu identity. And if they did, they would torture them. So it's very much like filtration that the Russians did. So the idea of extinguishing, destroying an identity is characteristic of colonial movements. And what you're seeing in this case is a demand to extinguish an identity. So that very much is what the British were all about. They were like, we're going to get rid of these identities. Now, there's another parallel, I think, as Radinsky says in his work. I think he makes this point. Alexei Radinsky, whose papers in E-Flux I teach, where he says just because there's no ocean between Russia and Ukraine doesn't mean it's not a colonial situation. I was just talking to Vladimir Klitschko, who said even after the Soviet Union fell, CNN for Eastern Europe was based in Moscow. And he's like, and all the businesses ran from Moscow. There's many markers of colonial situations here.
And how common is this situation of, like when the colony denies the right, not saying you're minor, but like you're saying, you don't exist.
Exactly. I think that, as I said, no two colonial situations are the same. there's a couple things you would say about the distinctive nature of this. First of all, it's unusual to say, okay, the Ukrainians aren't really Ukrainian, they're really Russian. The British didn't say the Kenyans aren't really their tribe, they're really British. They didn't say that. And the other thing is the civilization savagism paradigm. With European colonialism in Africa, the idea was they're savages, they have no history, we're the only people with history. And then the question is that happening here? Now, in some sense, it is happening because the Russians are saying Ukrainians have no independent history. So they are saying the classical things. It's classic colonialism when you say the colony has no history. What you are doing in a different way, you're saying the same thing. Russians are saying Ukrainians have no history. The British created schools in Kenya where the students learned everything about British history and nothing about their own history. Something like that is happening here, the erasure of history. And then something that I noticed when I taught Putin's speeches the other day in my classes, in my lecture, was that he does talk about civilization.
So what do you think are the questions which the academia today should kind of ask? Because people agree that there is something kind of messed up. We didn't find a common language. Sometimes there is misunderstanding when Ukrainians try to push this narrative of colonialism. The scholars should research more. What?
This is, I think, to me, the biggest puzzle. And maybe Foucault addresses it or something. Why is it that all of these authoritarian movements revolve around attacks on LGBT everywhere in the world? So why is that? It's central to Putin's Russia. It's not peripheral. It's central to Putin's Russia. That, the idea that the West is decadent comes with LGBT. It was central to the Nazis. It wasn't peripheral. It's central to the American right. What's going on there? Why is it? What's the theoretical explanation for why attacks on democracy so often take the form of attack on women's rights and attack on LGBT? That needs to be front and center.
I'm speaking in particular about colonialism. The question how to research colonialism in a way that you put what's going on in between Ukraine and Russia. I'm not asking about a definite answer, but the research question.
So going back to colonialism, that was really talking about fascism, what I just said. I think you have to keep in mind no two colonial situations are the same. I think you have to look for certain markers like civilization savagism. The colonial power says it's defending civilization against some set threat from the colonized or some, they don't have civilization. The metropole, that the colonial power has the city that typically people went to if they wanted to really make it in intellectual life, business life. So these parallels, the question you asked about extinguishing identity, I think if we look at Pakistan and Bangladesh, we see a colonial situation where Pakistanis were like, no, the Bengalis are really Pakistani.
You're speaking about the war which was followed after the independence of Pakistan and then the separation of the two states.
Precisely.
Where
hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people were killed. And I think the reason was Pakistanis said there's no independent Bangladesh.
By the way, how dangerous can be the use of the term and misuse of it today? So we're speaking about modern Modi India, who is kind of anti-colonial. But so that's why for me it's a question how we can, deal with this concept and where are the concerns.
Fanon talks about this in his essay on violence. He says, the anti-colonial struggle, after you win, anti-colonialism and nationalism have to change so they don't turn in on the minorities in the country. So what you see in India is that. You see the struggle against Britain then becoming a move to take the dominant identity, the Hindu identity, and claim that it is the true identity of India, and that's what anti-colonialism consists in. Israel also represented itself as an anti-colonial struggle. So we have to recognize that after you win, and this is the moral for Ukraine, you can't have a kind of anti-colonialism like Hindu nationalism.
How would you explain that much of the concept of, and why they pop up? I'm speaking about kind of useful idiots on the left, which pop up and which disappoint us so much among some brave human right advocates, people who, went to disclose the crimes of Pol Pot, but then would be apologists for other crimes, like, unfortunately, John Pilger, or like number of others, what happened to Chomsky, what happened to quite a few left intellectuals, which did something good in the beginning of their career, but then you can say they become the useful idiots of a lot of autocrats.
It's not like Chomsky did something good earlier in his career and then went bad. He's wrong about certain things and right about others. This is going to shock you, Natalia. People can be wrong about some things and right about other things. And that's really important, I think, and hard to keep in mind. Like, for instance, as a leftist coming from America, it's hard to see that the Soviet Union was kind of all bad in its sphere of influence. And coming from the former Soviet Union, it's hard to see that the United States was not all good. In its sphere of influence, it acted a lot like the Soviet Union did. So those are hard because you think the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And people make different errors. Chomsky's error in the case of Ukraine is thinking that it'll result in a nuclear war, and he's always terrified of nuclear war. But I think the response is you cannot say that anyone with nuclear weapons can do whatever they want, or else the world is over. People can be wrong. That shows that the categories of left and right are not very helpful because there's so many different kinds of right wing. There's so many different kinds of left wing. So these ways of thinking obscure the fact that one and the same person can be both wrong and right.
You are teaching philosophy at Yale. You're teaching all over the world all this concept big about fascism, colonialism, everything. And then you come democracy and you arrived here where things matters, where all these terms, they're not theoretical. They're not from the books. We implement some of them. We experience them on the daily life. So what is your major take away being here and understanding, how it feels on the ground, living through that? What have you learned, not from the books, which you would tell in your classes because of what's going on now in Ukraine?
Well, what has taken me a while to shift into is the fact that Ukrainians are creating their identity now. And so I had the tendency when I came here to think there was such a thing as a Ukrainian, and then I just had to discover what that was. But that's not what's happening now. Ukrainians are debating among themselves about what kind of society they want to build. And so it isn't like there is this thing that is a Ukrainian that is set and unchanging, and you're trying to discover what that is. It's that a society under this kind of pressure, defending its space, is evolving and is a process it's a dynamic process.
But I need then to understand, what do you mean then by identity? Because there was kind of a different time, a different identity, a different idea of what a society is. It's not like it wasn't. It's like a vision of the society, the rules of engagement, because, it's like it was. It just could be different. We are defining what?
Take an example of different identities. You could think what it is to be Ukrainian is to be from a small village, Ukrainian Orthodox, have certain folk dances. Or you could think what it means to be Ukrainian is to fight for a free space, fight for tolerance, diversity, free argument. Those are different identities.
Is it the identity or the way you want to have your society? Because I rather look at that as like the way how we want to organize our society.
I'm taking identity to mean that, to be how you want to organize your society and your self-conception as a society. If this war is just about whose folk dances are better and whose folk dances will win, no one's going to be interested. I'm here because the conception of the society, to use your terms, is in flux. It's changing. And it's a realization of the democratic ideals of making up your own mind.
Thank you so much. And we wish you all luck, all of us. And thank you again for your support to Ukraine by being here, by teaching here, but also by giving your salary to Ukrainian civil society organization, to Ukrainian foundation like Come Back Alive, who will use it in the best way. We need to defend what we were speaking?
I'm very aware when I'm in Kyiv that I'm safe because of the Ukrainian armed forces. Thank you so much.